They say blood is thicker than water, but what happens when that blood carries the weight of unspeakable sins? My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 34 years, I believed my father was a hero. Detective James Mitchell, 25 years on the force, recipient of 3 commendations for bravery, the man who taught me to ride a bike and never missed a single one of my soccer games. The man whose dying words would shatter everything I thought I knew about justice, family, and the thin line between good and evil. It was a Tuesday when the call came. Dad had collapsed at the precinct during what should have been a routine paperwork day. The doctors said it was massive cardiac arrest, likely brought on by years of stress and too many late-night cigarettes. I remember rushing to the hospital, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, thinking about all the conversations we'd never had, all the questions I'd never asked. I thought I was racing against time to say goodbye. I had no idea I was racing toward a truth that would destroy the very foundation of who I am. He was conscious when I arrived, barely, his weathered face pale against the stark white hospital sheets. The machines around him beeped and hummed with mechanical precision, counting down the final moments of a life I thought I understood completely. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice a shadow of its former commanding presence. "There's something you need to know." His eyes, once sharp and alert, now clouded with pain and something else. Something that looked suspiciously like guilt. "Don't talk, Dad." "Save your strength," I said, but he gripped my hand with surprising force. "No, listen to me. In my desk at home, bottom drawer, behind the false panel. There's a key. Safety deposit box. First National Bank. Box 847. Each word seemed to cost him tremendous effort. "Sarah, I need you to promise me something. When you find what's in there, remember that I loved you. Remember that everything I did because I believed it was right at the time. I should have known then." The way his voice cracked on those final words, the way he couldn't meet my eyes when he said it. But grief has a way of making us blind to the signs we don't want to see. He died that night, holding my hand, and I thought the worst pain I'd ever experienced was saying goodbye to the man who raised me. How naive I was. The funeral was everything you'd expect for a decorated police officer. The entire department turned out, their dress blues a sea of navy and gold against the gray October sky. Chief Morrison spoke about Dad's dedication, his integrity, his unwavering commitment to justice. "James Mitchell was the kind of cop we all aspire to be," he said, his voice carrying across the packed cemetery. "He never forgot that we serve the people, that our badge is a sacred trust." I remember nodding along, tears streaming down my face, proud to be the daughter of such an honorable man. 3 weeks later, I finally worked up the courage to clean out his desk. The house felt different without him, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I found the false panel exactly where he described it, hidden behind a stack of old case files that I'd seen him poring over countless times throughout my childhood. The key was small, unremarkable, attached to a piece of paper with just a bank name and box number written in his careful handwriting. I told myself I was just tying up loose ends, handling his final affairs like any dutiful daughter would. The safety deposit box probably contained important documents, maybe his will, perhaps some family mementos he wanted to keep secure. I was wrong about everything. The bank was busy that morning, filled with the usual crowd of customers handling their mundane financial business. I presented the key and identification, filled out the required forms, and followed the clerk down into the vault. The safety deposit boxes lined the walls like silent sentinels, each one hiding its owner's most precious or most dangerous secrets. Box 847 was larger than I'd expected, and surprisingly heavy when the clerk helped me carry it to the private viewing room. "Take your time," she said, closing the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo with finality. I sat alone in that small, windowless room, staring at the metal box that contained the final message from my father. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid, and for one brief, shining moment, I still believed I was about to discover something that would make me proud. Instead, I found hell. The first thing I saw was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. Beneath it, stacks of photographs, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be police evidence bags with case numbers I didn't recognize. But it was the journal that drew my attention, its pages filled with my father's familiar handwriting. I opened it to the first entry, dated nearly 30 years ago, and began to read. March 15, 1994. The Hartley case is getting too much attention. 3 different detectives asking questions, and that reporter from the Tribune won't let it go. Sometimes you have to make hard choices to protect the greater good. Sometimes justice isn't about what's right, it's about what's necessary. My hands started shaking before I finished the first paragraph. This wasn't the voice of the man who taught me about integrity and doing the right thing. This was the voice of someone justifying the unjustifiable. I kept reading, hoping desperately that I was misunderstanding, that there was some explanation that would make this all make sense. The Hartley family will never know what really happened to their daughter, and maybe that's for the best. Some truths are too dangerous, too damaging to too many people. I've made sure the evidence points in a different direction. Case closed, everyone moves on, and the city stays safe. This is what being a real cop means, making the decisions no one else can make. The journal entries continued for years, each one more horrifying than the last. My father, the man I'd idolized, the hero of my childhood, had been systematically covering up crimes, manipulating evidence, and allowing killers to walk free. Not out of corruption or greed, but out of some twisted sense of protecting the greater good. He'd convinced himself that he was doing the right thing by doing terrible things. The photographs made everything worse. Crime scenes that had never been properly investigated, evidence that had mysteriously disappeared, witnesses who'd suddenly recanted their statements. I recognized some of the cases from old newspaper clippings I found mixed in with his files. The Morrison family murders, unsolved for 23 years. The disappearance of college student Rebecca Chase, officially listed as a runaway. The string of break-ins in the Riverside district that had terrorized families for months before suddenly stopping. All of them connected to my father. All of them buried by his hand. I sat in that sterile bank room for hours, reading through years of carefully documented crimes. Not crimes he'd committed himself, but crimes he'd allowed to continue, evidence he'd destroyed, investigations he'd derailed. The scope of it was staggering. This wasn't a few bad decisions or moments of weakness. This was a systematic pattern of corruption spanning decades, all justified by a man who'd convinced himself he was protecting people from truths they couldn't handle. The worst part was realizing how good he'd been at it. Every case he'd buried had been done with surgical precision, every piece of evidence destroyed or misdirected in a way that looked entirely natural. He'd used his reputation, his standing in the community, his relationships with other officers to orchestrate a cover-up so complete that no one had ever suspected him. Detective James Mitchell, the man everyone trusted, the cop other cops looked up to, had been hiding in plain sight. One entry, dated just 6 months before his death, still haunts me. Sarah asked me today why I chose police work. I told her it was because I wanted to help people, to make the world a little bit safer. That wasn't a lie. Everything I've done, every choice I've made, has been about protecting people from the darkness they don't even know exists. She'll understand someday. She has too. But I didn't understand. I don't understand. How do you protect people by letting their killers go free? How do you serve justice by destroying evidence? How do you help families by denying them the truth about their loved ones? These weren't mercy killings or crimes of passion that he'd covered up. These were cold, calculated murders, violent assaults, disappearances that had torn families apart and left communities living in fear. I thought about Mrs. Morrison, Rebecca Chase's mother, all the families who'd spent years wondering what had happened to their children, their spouses, their siblings. They'd lived with uncertainty, with hope that maybe someday they'd get answers, some sense of closure. My father had stolen that from them. He'd chosen to play God with their pain, deciding what they deserved to know and what they didn't. The evidence bags were the final nail in the coffin of my faith in him. Physical evidence from crime scenes, items that should have been processed, tested, entered into the system to help solve cases. Instead, they'd been sitting in a safety deposit box for decades, proof of crimes that would never be prosecuted, justice that would never be served. A bloody knife from the Morrison murders. Rebecca Chase's identification, found at a crime scene that was never properly investigated. Photographs that would have identified suspects who were never arrested. Each piece of evidence represented a choice my father had made to prioritize his version of peace over actual justice. He'd decided that some truths were too dangerous, some secrets too damaging to reveal. But dangerous to whom? Damaging to what? The more I read, the more I realized that many of his decisions seemed designed to protect the reputation of the police department, the political careers of certain officials, the social standing of prominent families in our community. This wasn't about protecting innocent people from harsh realities. This was about protecting powerful people from the consequences of their actions or their connections to those actions. My father had appointed himself judge and jury, deciding which crimes deserved investigation and which ones deserved to be buried forever. The final entry in the journal was dated just 2 weeks before his death. The chest pains are getting worse, and I know my time is running short. I've made arrangements for Sarah to find this after I'm gone. She's smart, stronger than she knows, and she has a moral compass that I seem to have lost somewhere along the way. What she does with this information will be her choice to make. I can only hope she'll understand that I never meant to hurt anyone, that every decision I made came from a place of love for this community and the people in it. Some bridges can't be uncrossed, some choices can't be undone. I've carried these secrets for 30 years, and now it's time to pass that burden to someone else. Burden. That's what he called it. Not justice delayed, not truth hidden, not families destroyed by his decisions. A burden. As if the weight of these secrets was somehow comparable to the weight of the crimes themselves, the weight of the lives lost or destroyed because he'd chosen to look the other way. I left the bank that day carrying more than just a box of evidence. I was carrying the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about my father, about justice, about the world I thought I understood. The drive home was a blur of tears and rage and disbelief. How do you process the realization that your hero was the villain all along? How do you reconcile 34 years of love and respect with the undeniable evidence of moral bankruptcy? That night, I sat in my father's study, surrounded by his commendations and awards, his photographs with mayors and police chiefs, his certificates of achievement and community service. All of it felt like elaborate props in a performance that had lasted his entire career. The man everyone thought they knew had never really existed at all. I called in sick to work the next day, and the day after that. I couldn't face the world yet, couldn't pretend that everything was normal when my entire reality had been turned upside down. Instead, I spent those days researching the cases mentioned in my father's journal, reading old newspaper articles, looking up families who'd been affected by these unsolved crimes. The Morrison family had never recovered from the murder of their parents and 2 young children. The sole survivor, 8-year-old Tommy Morrison, had spent his life in and out of therapy, never able to move past the trauma of finding his family's bodies. He died by suicide 10 years ago, unable to live with the nightmares and the questions that would never be answered. Questions that could have been answered if my father had done his job instead of covering up evidence. Rebecca Chase's mother had died 3 years ago, still believing her daughter might someday walk through the door. She'd spent her life savings hiring private investigators, following false leads, clinging to hope that grew dimmer with each passing year. In her obituary, it mentioned that her final wish was for someone to find Rebecca and bring her home. My father's evidence bags contained proof of what had happened to Rebecca, proof that could have given her mother peace decades ago. Family after family, case after case, all of them connected by my father's decision to prioritize his version of order over their right to truth. The scope of the damage was staggering, not just in terms of crimes that went unpunished, but in terms of lives destroyed by uncertainty, families torn apart by unanswered questions, communities that lived in fear because killers were allowed to remain free. And then came the question that would define the rest of my life: what was I supposed to do with this knowledge? The ethical answer seemed obvious. Take the evidence to the police, to the district attorney, to someone in authority who could reopen these cases and finally give these families the justice they'd been denied. Let the chips fall where they may, regardless of how it would destroy my father's reputation and legacy. Let the truth come out, no matter how painful or embarrassing it might be for the police department, for the officials who'd worked with him, for the community that had trusted him. But it wasn't that simple. Nothing about this situation was simple. My father was dead. He couldn't be prosecuted, couldn't be held accountable for his actions. Revealing his crimes wouldn't bring him to justice, it would only destroy the memory of him held by everyone who'd known and respected him. His former partners, officers who'd looked up to him, community members who'd felt safer because of his presence, all of them would have to live with the knowledge that they'd been deceived by someone they trusted completely. More complicated still was the question of what revealing this information would accomplish for the actual cases involved. Most of the crimes were decades old. Evidence would be difficult to process after so much time, witnesses might be dead or unable to testify, and the perpetrators themselves might be beyond reach of justice. Would reopening these investigations actually lead to prosecutions, or would it just cause more pain for families who'd finally found ways to move forward with their lives? I spent weeks wrestling with these questions, lying awake at night thinking about Tommy Morrison, about Rebecca Chase's mother, about all the families who'd been denied closure because of my father's decisions. But I also thought about my father's former partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez, who'd spoken at the funeral about how much my dad had meant to him as a mentor and friend. I thought about my father's neighbors, his church congregation, his bowling league teammates, all the people who'd been touched by the man they thought he was. Did I have the right to destroy their memories of him? Did I have the right to shatter their faith in the police, in the system, in the belief that good people were working to protect them? My father had made the choice to hide the truth because he thought it would cause too much damage. Was I about to make the same choice, just in the opposite direction? The more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no clean answer, no choice that wouldn't cause tremendous pain to innocent people. This was the burden my father had written about, the weight of carrying secrets that hurt people regardless of whether they're revealed or hidden. He'd chosen to protect some people at the expense of others. Now I had to make the same impossible choice. I decided to start small. I researched the families affected by these cases, trying to determine who was still alive, who might benefit from finally learning the truth, and who might be better served by being allowed to maintain whatever peace they'd managed to find. It was an arrogant exercise, I realize now, trying to play the same kind of God that my father had played. But I couldn't see any other way forward. The first person I contacted was Michael Morrison, Tommy Morrison's older brother, who'd been away at college when his family was murdered. He was living in Seattle now, working as a social worker, trying to help other people deal with trauma and loss. I called him on a Tuesday evening, my hands shaking as I dialed the number I'd found through online searches. Mr. Morrison, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm calling about your family's case from 1994. I believe I have information that might help provide some answers. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. After all these years? What kind of information? I could hear the hope in his voice, mixed with a fear of being disappointed again. How many times had he gotten calls like this? How many false leads had he followed, how many promises had been broken? I need to explain this in person, if you're willing. It's complicated, and it's going to be difficult to hear. But I believe it might finally give you the answers you've been looking for. We arranged to meet the following weekend. He was flying in from Seattle, taking time off work, reorganizing his entire life around the possibility of finally learning what had happened to his family. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. What if the evidence in my father's safety deposit box didn't actually provide the closure he was hoping for? What if it just raised more questions, opened new wounds, made the pain worse instead of better? I was about to potentially destroy this man's life all over again, 29 years after my father's decisions had first robbed him of peace. When Michael Morrison walked into the coffee shop where we'd agreed to meet, I recognized him immediately from old newspaper photos. He had the same eyes as his younger brother Tommy, the same facial structure, but his face was marked by decades of grief and unanswered questions. He looked older than his 47 years, worn down by the weight of carrying unsolved trauma. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that was both firm and desperate. "I have to admit, I almost didn't come. I've been down this road so many times, followed so many leads that went nowhere. But something in your voice when you called." He trailed off, studying my face intently. "You said your last name was Mitchell. Any relation to Detective James Mitchell? He worked on my family's case back in the day." The irony was so cruel it took my breath away. "Yes," I managed to say. "He was my father." Michael's face lit up with something approaching joy, and I felt sick to my stomach. "Your father was a good man," he said. "One of the few cops who seemed to really care about what happened to my family. He spent hours with me after the funeral, promised me he'd never give up on finding who did it. I always wondered why the case went cold so quickly after he was reassigned to other duties." He paused, his expression shifting to concern. "Is he? You said was my father." "He died recently," I said, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. "And before he died, he gave me information about your family's case. Information that's going to be very difficult for you to hear." Michael leaned forward, his entire body tense with anticipation. I spent the next hour destroying his faith in everything he believed about his family's case, about my father, about the justice system that had failed him so completely. I showed him copies of the journal entries, photographs of evidence that had never been processed, documentation of leads that had been deliberately ignored. I watched his face cycle through disbelief, anger, devastation, and finally a kind of numb acceptance. "He knew," Michael said finally, his voice hollow. "All these years, he knew who killed my family, and he chose not to pursue it. Why? Why would he do that?" I read him the relevant journal entries, my father's justifications for protecting certain individuals whose prosecution might have caused political or social disruption. Protection that had cost Michael's family their lives and cost Michael himself any hope of closure or justice. "There's more," I said, and handed him copies of the physical evidence my father had hidden away. The bloody knife that could have been DNA tested, the fingerprints that were never run through the system, the witness statements that were never followed up on. Enough evidence to potentially solve the case even now, decades later. Michael stared at the papers for a long time, tears streaming down his face. "Tommy died thinking he was crazy," he said finally. He remembered seeing someone leaving the house that night, but the police said there was no evidence to support his account. It drove him to madness, thinking he'd imagined it, thinking he'd failed his family by not being able to help catch their killer. "Your father let my little brother die thinking he was insane rather than admit he'd buried evidence that would have proven Tommy was telling the truth. That was the moment I realized there was no going back. Whatever consequences my father's exposure might have for his reputation, for the police department, for the community's faith in law enforcement, they paled in comparison to the consequences of continuing to hide the truth. Michael Morrison deserved to know what had happened to his family. Tommy Morrison had deserved to die knowing he wasn't crazy. Rebecca Chase's mother had deserved to know what happened to her daughter before she died, still hoping for her return. What do you want to do with this information? I asked Michael. He looked up at me, his eyes clear and determined despite his tears. I want justice, he said. Not for me, not even for my family anymore, they're beyond justice now. But for everyone else who's been affected by these crimes your father chose to hide. How many other families are out there, still wondering, still hoping, still dying without answers because your father decided their pain was less important than protecting the reputation of some corrupt cops or dirty politicians? That question haunted me as I began reaching out to other families affected by the cases in my father's journal. Each conversation was more heartbreaking than the last. Each family had been destroyed in different ways by the lack of closure, the absence of justice, the corrosive effects of unanswered questions. Margaret Chen, whose daughter Linda had disappeared during what my father's records showed was a human trafficking operation that he'd chosen not to investigate because it would have implicated several prominent businessmen. Margaret had spent her life savings searching for Linda, had ruined her marriage and alienated her other children in her desperate quest for answers. Linda's body had been found years ago, but the connection to the trafficking ring had been buried along with any hope of prosecuting those responsible. David and Patricia Williams, whose son Marcus had been killed in what appeared to be a random mugging but which my father's files revealed was actually a targeted hit ordered by a drug dealer who was serving as a police informant. The killer had never been arrested because prosecuting him would have compromised an ongoing investigation that my father considered more important than Marcus's life. Case after case, family after family, all connected by my father's arrogant decision that he knew better than the justice system how to balance the scales of right and wrong. He'd appointed himself judge and jury, deciding which crimes deserved attention and which victims deserved justice. In every case, he'd prioritized the protection of powerful interests over the rights of ordinary people to truth and accountability. The evidence I gathered painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond my father's individual choices. He'd been part of a network of officials, prosecutors, and judges who'd worked together to bury cases that might prove embarrassing or damaging to the wrong people. The victims were always the same: working-class families, minorities, people without the political connections or financial resources to demand better treatment from the system. 3 months after opening that safety deposit box, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I contacted investigative journalist Patricia Wells at the Tribune, the same reporter my father had mentioned disparagingly in several journal entries. I arranged to meet her at her office on a Thursday afternoon, bringing with me copies of everything I'd found. Patricia was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with graying hair and the kind of intense focus that comes from years of digging into stories that powerful people don't want told. She listened to my explanation without interruption, occasionally taking notes, her expression growing more serious as I detailed the scope of what I'd discovered. "This is incredible," she said when I'd finished. "And horrible. Do you understand what you're doing? This isn't just about your father. This implicates dozens of people, some of whom are still in positions of power. The police department, the district attorney's office, several judges who are still on the bench. You're talking about bringing down an entire system of corruption that's been operating for decades." I nodded. "I know. But these families deserve the truth. They deserve justice, even if it's decades late. My father made the choice to prioritize protecting the system over protecting the people it was supposed to serve. I can't make the same choice." Patricia studied me carefully. "This is going to destroy your father's reputation. Everything people believed about him, everything he meant to his colleagues and friends and community, it's all going to be exposed as a lie. Are you prepared for that? Are you prepared for the hatred you're going to face from people who loved and respected him?" "I've thought about that," I said. "I've thought about little else for months. But I keep coming back to Tommy Morrison, dying by suicide because he thought he was crazy. I keep thinking about Rebecca Chase's mother, dying still hoping her daughter would come home. I keep thinking about all the families who never got closure because my father decided their pain was less important than protecting corrupt officials. How do I live with that knowledge and do nothing?" Patricia agreed to investigate the story, with the understanding that she would independently verify every claim before publication. She spent the next 6 months tracking down sources, interviewing family members, consulting with experts in forensic analysis and police procedure. The story she eventually published was devastatingly thorough, laying out 30 years of systematic corruption with meticulous detail and unassailable evidence. The reaction was everything I'd feared and worse. My father's former colleagues accused me of betraying his memory, of destroying the reputation of a good man for attention or money. The police union issued a statement questioning my mental stability and suggesting I was fabricating evidence to serve some unknown agenda. Anonymous callers left threatening messages on my answering machine, accusing me of being a traitor to law enforcement and promising consequences for my actions. But there were other reactions too. Michael Morrison called to thank me for giving him the closure he'd been seeking for decades. Margaret Chen sent a letter expressing gratitude that her daughter's case was finally being reopened. Families I'd never contacted reached out to share their own stories of cases that had been mysteriously dropped or investigations that had seemed deliberately derailed. The investigation that followed Patricia's story uncovered an even broader pattern of corruption than my father's journal had revealed. 3 sitting judges were indicted for taking bribes to dismiss cases or impose lenient sentences. The former district attorney was charged with obstruction of justice for his role in burying evidence. 24 police officers, some retired, some still active, faced disciplinary action or criminal charges for their participation in the cover-ups. The police chief who had spoken so eloquently at my father's funeral was forced to resign in disgrace when his own involvement in the corruption network came to light. The community's faith in law enforcement was severely shaken, and it took years of reform and transparency initiatives to begin rebuilding trust between the police and the people they served. Through it all, I struggled with the question of whether I'd made the right choice. The revelations had caused tremendous pain to many innocent people. My father's widow, my stepmother Helen, had to move out of the neighborhood where they'd lived for 20 years because of the harassment and shame. Several of his former partners suffered heart attacks or nervous breakdowns under the stress of the investigation and the public scrutiny. But I also saw the positive changes that came from exposing the truth. The cases my father had buried were reopened, and several resulted in arrests and convictions even decades later. New protocols were put in place to prevent evidence from being buried or destroyed without proper oversight. A victims' rights organization was established to ensure that families affected by unsolved crimes would have advocates to prevent their cases from being forgotten or ignored. Most importantly, the truth had finally been told. The families who'd suffered in silence for decades finally had answers, even if those answers brought pain along with closure. The system that had failed them so spectacularly was forced to acknowledge its failures and take steps to prevent similar injustices in the future. 5 years have passed since I opened that safety deposit box and discovered the truth about my father. I still struggle with the contradictions of loving a man who did such terrible things, of reconciling the father who taught me about integrity with the detective who systematically violated every principle he claimed to hold dear. I've come to understand that people are capable of remarkable compartmentalization, of being genuinely good in some aspects of their lives while being destructively corrupt in others. I think my father truly believed he was doing the right thing. His journal entries show a man who convinced himself that his choices were necessary evils, sacrifices made for the greater good. He saw himself as a protector, shielding the community from truths that he believed would be too damaging or dangerous to reveal. In his mind, he was the hero of his own story, making the hard choices that no one else was willing to make. But good intentions don't justify evil actions. The families he betrayed, the victims whose cases he buried, the killers he allowed to remain free, they all paid the price for his arrogant assumption that he knew better than the justice system how to balance truth and consequences. His desire to protect some people came at the expense of abandoning others, and that trade-off was never his to make. I still live with the burden he passed to me, the weight of knowing that my actions destroyed the faith and trust of people who had genuinely loved and respected him. I receive letters from his former colleagues, from community members who feel betrayed not just by him but by me for exposing his secrets. They ask how I could do this to his memory, how I could destroy the legacy of a man who had done so much good in his life. My answer is always the same: I couldn't live with being part of the cover-up he created. I couldn't know what I knew and choose to protect his reputation at the expense of the families he had betrayed. The burden he gave me wasn't the burden of keeping his secrets. It was the burden of choosing between competing loyalties, between love for him and justice for his victims. I chose justice. I chose truth. I chose to honor the real victims of his crimes rather than protect the false image he had constructed over decades of deception. It was the hardest choice I've ever had to make, and I'm still not entirely sure it was the right one. But I'm certain it was the only choice I could live with. The will my father left behind wasn't written on paper. It was written in evidence and confessions, in buried cases and hidden truths. It was a legacy of corruption disguised as service, of evil justified as necessity. He left me the choice of whether to continue his cover-up or expose his crimes, and in making that choice, I learned something crucial about the nature of justice and the responsibility we all bear for the systems we're part of. Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty, it's about honoring the victims, acknowledging their suffering, and ensuring that their pain isn't forgotten or dismissed for the convenience of others. Truth isn't always comfortable or convenient, but it's the foundation upon which any just society must be built. My father spent 30 years choosing comfort and convenience over truth and justice. I spent one agonizing decision choosing differently. The real will he left behind wasn't a gift, it was a test. A test of whether I would perpetuate his betrayal of the innocent or find the courage to stand up for the victims he had abandoned. In the end, I hope I honored the better angels of the man who raised me, even as I exposed the demons that had consumed his professional life. The father I loved taught me about integrity and doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. In exposing his crimes, I was following the lessons he'd taught me, even though I was betraying the man who had taught them. That's the real tragedy of his story, and mine. The very values he instilled in me as a father were the ones that compelled me to expose his failures as a police officer. He created his own downfall by raising a daughter who couldn't live with injustice, even when that injustice came from the person she loved most in the world. I miss him every day. I mourn not just for the father I lost, but for the man I thought he was, the hero who never really existed except in my imagination. But I don't regret my choice to expose the truth. The families who finally got closure, the victims who were finally acknowledged, the system that was finally forced to confront its failures, they all deserved better than continued silence and cover-up. Some truths are too important to bury, no matter how much pain they cause. Some secrets are too destructive to keep, regardless of who gets hurt when they're revealed. My father spent his career making the opposite choice, and I've spent the last 5 years living with the consequences of refusing to make the same mistake. The will he left behind exposed all his crimes, but it also revealed the kind of person he'd raised me to be, someone who couldn't turn away from injustice, even when it would have been easier, safer, and more comfortable to look the other way. In the end, that may be the only redemption his story offers, that his failures as a police officer couldn't completely corrupt his success as a father. He taught me to value truth and justice, even though he'd forgotten how to live by those values himself. His real legacy isn't the crimes he committed or covered up, it's the daughter who found the strength to choose differently, to honor his victims instead of protecting his reputation, to serve justice instead of serving family loyalty. That's the will my father really left behind, not a choice between right and wrong, but a choice between different kinds of love. Love for him and his memory, or love for the principles he'd taught me and then abandoned. I chose to love the principles, even though it meant betraying the man. I chose to honor the father who raised me to do the right thing, even though it meant exposing the detective who had forgotten what the right thing was. It's a choice I'll live with for the rest of my life, and I pray that somewhere, somehow, he would understand why I had to make it.